Okay, guys, we're going to get started with Chapter 12, which is Employment Law, Employment Regulation. Chapter 12 is similar to Chapters 4, Chapter 5, maybe Chapter 2, in terms of it can be a difficult chapter for people because there's a lot of storyline scenarios that could come into play. However, it differs from Chapters 4 and 5, especially somewhat too as well, in that he's never had a high percentage of the exam be Chapter 12. Even though it's a little more difficult, it usually is not as much as they say the business entities or the four major labor acts of labor law when Chapter 12 was on exam 3. It's been moved to exam 4 for this exam. So it goes along with chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16, whichever, if you're in 209 or 211 for those. So it may come up with a bigger percentage than it usually does. And if so, can be the more difficult material. Storyline scenarios like Chapter 4 contracts and Chapter 5 torts. However, there is not a large percentage usually of the exam comes from Chapter 12. We're going to go over Chapter 12 in normal time. We're not going to do anything different. We'll go probably 2 or 3 different sessions on it for all the different things. And then at the very end of your packet, everybody should have their red packet. We're going to be doing the red packet. At the very end of the red packet, there's a discrimination quiz. I'm not sure how I'm going to do this. This is usually an in-class exercise. If I do it, it'll be its own separate little video, or maybe I'll combine it with a question and answer session, depending on how it goes. My plan is to get chapters 12 and chapter 14 done today, Monday, and Tuesday, maybe even both on Monday as well, so that you have all the chapters that are in your exam, or 2 of the chapters that are in your exam already done. And this is for 209 and 211. These chapters don't change. Now, for the rest of the chapters in 209 and 211, they are different. So you need to make sure you click on the right video for later on. We'll discuss all that as well a little bit later. Okay, let's go ahead and go over the material. On page 305 of your study guide, we start with the study guide in terms of employment regulation. The first question that's been on the exams before is, what is the difference between, say, an employee-employer, an employer-employee with an agency relationship, an employer-independent contractor? What's the difference between those for an exam question? And he usually gives a storyline scenario and basically says a couple of things about what's going on, and you have to determine whether or not it's an employer-employee, an employer-employee with an agency relationship, or more employer-independent contractor situation. Here's the thing. If it is employer-employee, i.e. also known as master-servant, those could be on separate lines of your exam. Master-servant is the old term, employer-employee is the main term. This is going to be mainly manual labor or cheaper labor. If you're in a job in which you get paid a minimum wage or just above a minimum wage or manual type labor, it is likely going to be employer-employee, i.e. master-servant. If it is master-servant, the employee is told directly by the employee. Now, it could be employer, the manager could do it, supervisors could do it, stuff like that. But the employer is going to dictate how the control of the job is going to be done, i.e. the control rests with the employer, and maybe it's managers, supervisors, and stuff like that. The employee does not have authority to represent the employer in business transactions though. They're a minimum wage worker, somebody that works at a Walmart. It's not a manager, someone that works as just a stock employee at Kroger. They can't conduct business transactions with third parties, typically on behalf of the employer. They can interact with customers all the time, but they do not do anything in regards to representation. The employers are still going to be liable for the employees' situations and things that they do. You might have an exam question on exam 2 with torts liability. McDonald's employee coming across the countertop and beating up a customer. The employer would be held responsible under a master-servant relationship for this. Okay? Now, once again, master-servant, the older method is term-wise employer-employee. What this means is the employee has very little control over doing the job. The control aspect rests with the employer, either through its supervisors, managers, or whatnot, but the employer dictates control. Thus, there is more liability for the employer. So think about it this way. The less control by the employee, the more liability for the employer. Or the more control the employer has, the more liability that employer has as well. You can think of it either way. So as we go across this little continuum that we're going to go across, starting with master servant, the more control the employer has over the job, i.e. the less control the employee has, the more liability that employer has as well. All right, the next one we have is employer-employee with an agency relationship. This is where the employee can conduct business transactions on behalf of the employer with third parties. This would be more like a real estate agent. This would be more like a sales agent for a company. Say you work for CC Creations and you're in charge of sales for fraternities and sororities at Texas A&M. You would have the ability to, without interacting with CC's upper management, to make contracts with these sororities and fraternities as basically an arm of the CC Creations name. And the key is that the employee is hired to have the authority to conduct business on behalf of the employer with third parties, not just interact and sell something to them, i.e. like a Walmart employee would do, but to actually interact into contract situations and stuff like that. Real estate transaction, which a real estate agent would be an excellent example of this. The more representative, the more idea that you are an agent type situation, the more control you have over the job, not complete control, the more control you have over the job. And thus, the liability is a little bit less for the employer, especially in areas that you kind of have more of an authority. That doesn't mean that the employer is not going to be liable. The employer is still going to be liable, but the employee can be liable as well, much more so. And think about it like agency law in Chapter 4. The agent messed up, the agent is liable, but the employer could also be liable, and then that employer could go after the employee if they wanted to. The last one is employer independent contractor. This is where the employer hires someone with a specific skill set to do the job. They own the tools to do the job. They have the skills to do the job. They are contracted specifically to do a job. They are not going to be liable for the independent contractor's damages or injuries or something like that because they are going to have the tools and skills necessary to do the job. And what it's basically going to boil down to is the employer is just going to be satisfied with the job or not satisfied, but they'll pay the independent contractor for the work done. It would be like me. I can change light bulbs. I can do general repair work. I can do general plumbing work in my house. But if it's a major job, I'm going to call an electrician. I'm going to call a plumber. I'm going to call a roofer to do the job because they have the specific skill set. Now, once they've done the job, I'm going to look over and make sure it looks satisfactory to me before I pay them. But I'm not going to look over their shoulder and say, don't you need to do this? Don't you need to do that? If you need to do that or this, I would just hire someone, a manual employee or a master servant, and just tell them what to do. I don't have a specific skill set. Because of that, an independent contractor is much more liable for his or her actions, more so than the employer that hires them. So the employer is not usually liable for any torts or anything that the independent contractor does. It could be somewhat to an agency relationship that's even moved further along that continuum that I was talking about earlier. But usually the employer doesn't have control over because they don't have the skill set for the job until the job is done. And then the employer can sign off on the work that's actually completed. So think about it this way. As we go down this continuum, you may have a storyline that he asks you. And he'll ask you, what likely employment relationship do the employer and the employee have? And then you're going to go through that. It could be master servant, just employer-employee, manual labor jobs, minimum wage type jobs to fall under this, where the employer is under the has direct control or supervision in some capacity over the employee's job. Therefore, the employee basically does what is done. If they are given a specific list of tasks to do and told how to do them, that is likely going to be master servant or employer-employee. As you are able to interact with third parties and enter into contracts on behalf of the employer, then that is going to be more employee with an agency relationship. As you have the skills and tools to do the job, Your job is going to be finalized. The employer is going to sign off on it. That is going to be much more independent contract. Now, if you remember, independent contractor is one of those ones that didn't fall under the Wagner Act. You might want to note that for a multiple choice answer, even though Chapter 8 is no longer on the exam, Chapter 12 used to be on the exam. Therefore, you need to know that an independent contractor is not under Wagner because of that listing of exceptions. And that only applies to a given storyline situation that you may have. All right. The next thing that we need to go over is employment at will. Employment at will is a general doctrine that is statewide and nationwide under common law. Various states have modifications of employment at will, but employment at will, an employee can quit at any time for virtually any reason. Don't have to give 2 weeks notice. That's just a courtesy. So you can quit at any time for any reason. If you don't like the way your boss is treating you, you can just quit right then and there. But on the same token, employment at will doctrine also allows the employer to fire an employee for almost any reason at virtually any time. So the employee can quit at any time for virtually any reason. The employer can fire an employee for almost any reason, almost being a key exception. Okay. So in terms of that, employment at will doctrine, it rests with the employer. And think about it in terms of times like this or the coronavirus. The employer can get rid of all the employees because we have an employment at will doctrine right now. They can furlough them, they can get rid of them, they can hire them when they can available later on. Or they can hire a bunch of employees if they so choose, because the needs are going to rest with the employer. All right. So we have the employer can fire an employee for almost any reason. You'll notice on page 306 of your study guide, it has almost underlined, and it used to be bolded, but it's no longer bolded. Almost any time or any reason. The reason for almost is because there are exceptions. And we're about to go over these exceptions that are on the exam and things that you need to know. One of them is going to be contractual exceptions. We're going to talk about that in a few seconds. Then you have state common law or state public policy exceptions. Then you have statutory law, state statutory law protections. And then you have federal discrimination law that comes into play. The next couple of pages in your study guide, page 306, 307, are going to deal with 3 of these. The fourth one is a combination of all the federal discrimination law like Title VII, Civil Rights Act, Equal Pay Act, all those different acts that we're going to go over as exceptions as well. Now remember, when the employer can fire an employee for virtually any reason at any time, almost any reason with exceptions, they have the balance of power. So note that. The first exception that we have is contractual. If the employer and the employee enter into an agreement, then if it is contractually created, now whether that could be that could be language-based as written or oral, doesn't really matter. Some have to be in written form, statute of frauds. But if it is a contractual agreement between them, then there's an exception to that almost any reason at any time. That's one of the exceptions. And under contractual exceptions, we have 3 different types. An express contract. An express contract is going to be language-based, and it's usually going to be based on a time horizon. You sign a contract to work for the company for a period of 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever it is. If you sign that contract, then unless they can show justification for firing you, and we'll get to that in a little while, justification or just cause for firing you, they must honor the terms of the contract. So if they fire you after year 1 of a 3-year contract without cause, then they're going to have to pay you for the additional 2 years. And think of it like football players or basketball players. You get fired, basketball player gets fired with 2 years remaining on their contract, they're going to get paid for those 2 years unless there was just cause for firing. We'll get into just cause in a little while. This gives the employer job security. And that is one of the reasons why they may take on a job is because of that job security that comes with an express contract. And you have the example in study guide on page 306. An employee is given a 3-year contract to move to Kuwait by an oil company for a specific job. A friend of mine years ago was about to pay for all his daughter's college. He had 3 daughters that were graduating basically one after another. So he had sophomore, junior, senior. He left the Texas A&M system and went and worked for a defense contractor in Afghanistan because they signed into a 4-year contract. So he's gone for 4 years. Obviously, he was able to come and go a little bit, but for gone for 4 years, but they paid him 3 times his normal salary because he was in basically a war zone, a hot zone. And because of that, unless there was just cause for firing him, he got paid for those 4 years, whether he left, whether They fired him after a year. There's no just cause. He was given that 4-year contract. The only reason he left was to pay for their college educations by gaining that extra triple salary for those 3-4 years. All right, that's an express contract. An implied contract is based upon written or oral statements that don't specifically really go to any one employee. So if the employer enters into a 3-year contract with Frank, then that would be an express contract that we talked about before. But if the employer talks about all these different statements and policies and practices that the organization is going to do while that employer is in charge, and then announces that these employees have done a good job under these policies, and then fire that employee a week later because of whatever reason, if there's no just cause, then that would be an implied contract. It's not a specific contract between the employer and Frank. It's a contract implied through all the employees. If they do a good job and are working hard and everything like that, they will have a job with them for the company. As long as they continue to do the job despite conflicts with other employees, you have the job. So say Frank, and I'm just saying you don't have an actual 3-year contract with Frank. Say Frank is told in a meeting with a bunch of other employees, all y'all are doing a great job. As long as you continue to do the job the way you're doing it, even with conflicts amongst coworkers, you have a job here. We've got you a job. And then everybody behind Frank's back says that they can't work for this person for another couple of years. It's impossible. Okay? So all of a sudden, the employer sees all these statements made by other employees and fires Frank. Now, Frank didn't have that 3-year contract that was written, an express contract. So he would sue for maybe an implied contract. He did his work. Despite conflicts, he was still able to do his work. He was terminated without cause. If there's no cause, then he could sue for maybe an implied contract exception. The next one is implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. This is where there's no good cause for discharge after years and years of loyal service. And if anybody has any family members that are, teachers or something like that, maybe in the rule of 80 or rule of 90, which is at 90 years, either your age plus the number of years you've worked, or 80 is the old rule, 90 is the new rule now. But when you get to 90 or 80, if it's older, then you get paid you can basically fully retire. So if you have 24 years of experience and you're 56 years old, then that right there is 80 years. You have full retirement benefits if you were grandfathered in. Back then, 24 years ago, would have been the rule of 80. Now it's the rule of 90. So at 64, if you have 24 years experience, you've met 90 and you can fully retire. Okay? If you've worked for the company for years during hardships and you've stayed on with that company and been loyal to that company in years and years of service and had job opportunities that you have not accepted because you want to work for this company, and then right before all your benefits come in, full benefits, full pension, all that stuff, you're fired without cause, then that could be implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. If you're fired with years and years of loyal service and there's no justification, remember, we're going to get into just cause in a little while and why that's important. If you're fired without cause, then this could be implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. Now, that gives you a storyline. Look at number 4 at the very bottom, page 306. Employer makes certain promises to prospective employees to get them to come to work with the employee and does not deliver, then the employer fires the employee for no good cause. This could be good faith and fair dealing. Now, Texas does not adopt the good faith and fair dealing doctrine. So if you have a storyline in Texas, this is not going to be a viable option. And I would note that for a storyline. It gives you a storyline, and the storyline is in other states. And we'll go over like Montana, New York, Colorado, all those different states. But if it gives you Texas, we do not use implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. So those years and years of loyal service don't really matter as much in Texas. All right. Now, I talked about if you can't show cause. If you can show cause for firing someone, you always have the option to fire someone for just cause, just or good cause. This could be incompetence. This could be insubordination. This could be a financial hardship. Think about it this way in terms of the coronavirus. Employees are being laid off. That is just cause because the employer cannot continue to pay without expected revenues that they're not getting. They can't pay all their employees. So they're furloughing a lot of them, going to hire them back later, and or they're releasing them outright from their job because just cause. They can't afford the financial hardship of keeping on all those employees. If you violate the handbook, the employee's handbook, constantly, that would be just cause for firing someone. If you're incompetent, you show up for drunk for work, that would be incompetence. That would be something for just cause. So say you're required to work at Target. You're going to be a master servant, you're a minimum wage employee, master servant, controlled by the employer over you. They're going to be telling you exactly how to do the jobs. Okay? You come to work the first day wearing red, the next day you wear red, then the next day you're like, I don't have any more red shirts, I'm going to wear yellow. They tell you in the employee handbook, you wear red, go home, change, you go back, you get a yellow, you get a red shirt and come back. The next day you go to work and wear green. They say, no, you need to go. You go back, you get your red shirt, you come back. The next day you wear blue, a dingy blue, like you work at Walmart. And they're like, you're fired. That would be just cause because you consistently, one, incompetence for one, but insubordination because you violated the employee handbook. If it says to wear red, you wear red. So a violation of the employee handbook would be justifiable cause. If there is justifiable cause, insubordination, incompetence, financial hardship by the employer, then the other ones, those contractual exceptions, don't really apply as much, okay? You can always be discharged for just cause. All right. The next thing we have is state court or state public policy exception. And these are certain things that if you're given a storyline, you just need to know under common law, state court, state public policy exceptions. These are the state court would be common law, would be the way that the courts and legislatures at various states have chipped away at this employment at will doctrine. One, where public policy and the employer. If you're out for jury duty, they cannot fire you. You have common law protection, state court protection. If you refuse to disobey the law, we're going to get into this a little bit later, but the case of the very top page 307 is Pitts versus Clark Oil. In this situation, Pitts versus Clark Oil, an employee at a gas station was told to pump leaded gasoline in an unleaded only tank. The guy refused to do so, saying it was illegal to do so. The customer's like, no, I need the gas, go ahead and put it in. Because it's leaded, I can't put it into an unleaded only tank. He said, get your manager. The manager came out and said, go ahead, the customer wants it, put it in there. He says, I can't do that, it's against law. You're fired, okay? Yes, you've directly conflicted an order, but you refuse to disobey the law. You are grounds under state common law, public policy exceptions to keep your job, okay? Military service, if you, maybe 1 weekend a month, you're a part of the reserves, or you get called back to active duty. You have military service rights that give you legitimacy from having your job taken away under employment at will doctrine. If you exercise your rights of filing bankruptcy, filing a workers' compensation claim, or filing a lawsuit, those are all exceptions as well under state court public policy exceptions. Now, we're going to come back to these because say a little later on when we talk about workman's compensation, you get injured on the job and you decide to sue under workman's compensation or file for workman's compensation. I can't, as your employer, fire you for filing workman's compensation. You decide to file a lawsuit against me for negligence because you got injured. I can't fire you for that as well under state court public policy exceptions. Okay? So, once again, you have jury duty, refusal to disobey the law, military service, filing a bankruptcy claim, workers' compensation, or lawsuit. Those workers' compensation claims and lawsuits can come into another storyline a little bit later on. All right. Now, the other one is under state statutory law. So the first one we have is contractual. The second one we have is common law or state public policy exceptions, all those exceptions we went over. And then we have state statutory law. One state, Montana, requires a comprehensive protection from employment at will. You must show just cause. You must show good cause for firing someone. Remember, good cause, incompetence, insubordination, financial hardship by the employer. Okay? You cannot just fire somebody for any reason at any time. You must show justifiable cause for doing so. It's the only state in the United States that requires us to do so. It's even limited to 4 years of damages plus interest. So in Montana, if you're given a storyline in Montana, you must show just cause for firing someone, and the just cause is at the very bottom of page 306 of your study guide. Okay? Other states, they can fire you for virtually any reason at any time, and they don't have to show just cause, but in Montana, they would have to show just cause for firing someone. So say, for instance, I decide to fire someone, even though it's not against the rules or anything like that. You know, they wore green to work one day. It's not against the law, it's not against the rules, but I had just gotten in a bitter, divorce with my wife, and during our divorce proceedings and during some fights, she wore green. So that green just kind of, gets to me all the time. So I just say, you know what? You wore green today. I can't stand it. You're fired. That would be something that would not have good cause for doing so. But under employment at will, I have a lot of ability to do so. In Montana, I wouldn't. I have to show just cause for firing someone. Now, if you're told not to wear green and you do wear it, then that would be just cause because of insubordination. All right. Now, the other one is off-duty conduct. Montana, along with a bunch of other states, have off-duty conduct. Now, Montana and about 30 other states, so that means the majority of the states in the United States have these off-duty conduct statutes, state statutory law by the legislature. Montana and about 30 other states prevent someone from doing their legal activities outside of work. So if I'm 18 or older and I get if I'm smoking, if I'm over 21 and I'm drinking, if I'm over 18 in a strip club or something like that, or get a tattoo or something like that, those are all legal things I can do if I'm over the age of 21. Now, if I don't come to work, and smoke on the job when we're not allowed to, or I'm not coming to work drunk because I drank so much the night before, stuff like that, I have a legal right to do those things, okay? You can't fire me for doing something. So if you see me out at a strip club and you decide you're going to fire me because you see me drinking and being immoral at a strip club, well, one, you're, more of a kind of two-faced there a little bit when it comes to that, because you're at a strip club when you see me there. But beside that, you would not be able to fire me because those are legal things I can do. Now, if I come to work drunk the next day because I drank so much that night before, then yes, you can fire me for that, because that would be something that would fall under incompetence, insubordination, or work-related. But if I go skydiving, unless it's in our employee handbook that I can't do it, those are legal recreational activities. If I get a tattoo, it may have to be covered up because you have policies, but if I get them, you can't fire me for doing that, okay? Now, 3 other states, Colorado, New York, and North Dakota, also protect legal recreational activities. Now, legal recreational activities could include a lot of different things. Skydiving was mentioned earlier, coworkers, dating, stuff like that. You can't fire them for off-duty conduct that is illegal recreational activities. Now, let's use Colorado as an example, since Colorado is one of those states. In Colorado, I believe you have the ability to smoke marijuana legally in the state. However, it's still a violation under federal law for marijuana use. So even though the state is not going to cite you for any violation as long as you follow the rules in Colorado, it would still be illegal under federal law. So it would be illegal off-duty conduct. Off-duty conduct must be legal activities, and therefore you may have a problem. Now, Colorado has a legal recreational activities. It is a legal recreational activity in Colorado. So note those things and give it a storyline. All right. So let's go through that off-duty conduct statute with a case that he might have talked about a little bit later on. It's a Santa Fe case. There's a white employee and a black employee that were caught embezzling from the company, stealing from the company. They fired the white employee and kept on the black employee as a reverse affirmative action. They were under an affirmative action program, so they kept the black employee on to keep a quota system in place, but fired the white employee. The white employee sued for reverse discrimination. Reverse discrimination is where you discriminate against the majority rather than the minority. And we did this with the Hopwood TU Law case earlier on exam 1 as well. Okay, so in this situation, the white employee was fired, the black employee was kept on, just to fill a quota systems technique. Now, Here's the thing. If it was legal, it's not legal, so it doesn't fall under legal off-duty conduct. So they have the right to fire both of them or keep them both on. But when they fired one, kept one on, fired the other, that was a problem in terms of discrimination. So in this situation with the Santa Fe case, it was a discrimination suit filed, and the white employee won their job back with back pay because if they both committed the act, they both should have been fired or both should have been reprimanded but kept on. But they did it in a reverse discrimination. If they had fired the black employee and kept the white employee on, that would likely be just a regular discrimination case. Okay? All right. That is the 4 things of exceptions. So what we need to go through is employment at will. The employee can quit at any time for any reason. The employer can fire an employee for virtually any reason at almost any time. Contractual exceptions is 1. State court, i.e. common law or public policy exceptions like jury duty, disobey the refusal to disobey the law, military service, filing claims like bankruptcy, workman's comp, lawsuits are all going to be under that. State statutory law exceptions, Montana, the only one that requires you to show just cause. And remember, just cause, insubordination, incompetence, financial hardship. You guys show just cause for violation. Okay? Legal off-duty conduct in a majority of states. Legal off-duty conduct is protected in a majority of state statutory law, state legislatures, Montana, and a bunch of other states. And 3 states, Colorado, New York, and North Dakota, have also gone on to legal recreational activities. Now, it also includes California as well, and that's on page 307 in the middle. 3 states, Colorado, New York, North Dakota. But California, I believe, is in the actual textbook itself. I haven't looked at the new textbook typing, but California was in there. So there was a 4th state in case you're given it. Colorado, New York, North Dakota, California, in case you're given A, B, C, D, and E, and you got to pick out which one doesn't apply. Montana being the one that has the off-duty conduct completely, meaning just cause. All right. The next thing we're going to go over is going to be a lot of federal laws in the books that come into play for various laws. Now, some of these are going to be discrimination laws that we'll get into that'll basically be more the exception type things. And then some of them are just going to be basic laws dealing with employment in general. All right. Now, in your packet, you have the Employment Act. It's like the first page after the cover page and the questions in the back is the first page. And this is in somewhat chronological order, although they're messed up a little bit in terms of exact order like the study guide, and I'm going to fix that hopefully next semester, but that's irrelevant to y'all right now. Okay, the first one is the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, I talked about for your last exam how important the 4 major labor acts were on the exam. Norris LaGuardia, Wagner, formal and informal names. I think both based on some comments that were received email-wise and text message-wise, that the 4 major acts and the per se rule of reason was by far the biggest on exam 3. One of the biggest ones on exam 4 is acronyms. So you need to know your acronyms. If you're one of those people that likes to make index cards and just do acronyms, you can put the acronym on one side, get the full name on the other and what it does, and you do that, that's great if that's the way you learn, but you need to know acronyms. This especially applies in Chapter 14, Environmental Law, for both 209 and 211, but it also applies in Chapter 12 as well. The first one is the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA. He will use the acronym on this. Fair Labor Standards Act, created during the mid-New Deal era during Roosevelt's administration in 1938. It basically had 3 major provisions, and then you have a couple other little things that you need to add in terms of material that you need to know. But it has 3 major provisions. The first one is it provides a federal, not state, federal minimum wage rate for most, but not all American workers. And I would note that salaried employees don't necessarily fit that category. Minimum wage for most, but not all American workers. So note the not all portion just in case. It began at like 25 cents an hour, went up, it's now at $7.25 an hour. Now, states can increase this, but they can't decrease it. So the state wants to come up with a living wage or a higher state wage, like state of Washington, I think is like a minimum wage of $15 an hour. The city of Boston requires a living wage. This is done at the state level. That's fine, but they cannot go below the federal minimum wage standard for most, but not all American workers. But they can establish a living wage if they so choose. So if you're getting paid more than $7.25 an hour by law, that is probably not only a combination of federal FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, but also some state additional things as well under state law. But the federal minimum wage rate is $7.25. It could go up. But anyway, note that for the test. On the next page over, it talks on 308 about working overtime. Once again, for most, but not all American workers, if you work more than 40 hours, and he probably said in the video also, or an aggregate over 80 hours, so it could be like you work 50 in one week and 30 in the other, you wouldn't be able to get overtime pay, so to speak, because you can do it over a 2-week period. But if you get more than 40 hours, you can get overtime at time-and-a-half rate, 1.5 times your basic wage. Now, this doesn't apply to salaried workers once again, so it doesn't work to all American workers, but it will work for most American workers. It did not, and this is one of your multiple choice answers that you need to make sure, it did not establish an official 40-hour work week. The official 40-hour work week doesn't exist. What it does say is if you work over 40 hours in maybe a non-salary job, if you work more than 40 hours, you're going to get time and a half. And that could be an aggregate over a 2-week period, 80 hours over a 2-week period. But if you work more than 40 hours, you're going to get time and a half. Holiday pay could come in there as well for certain things also. But overtime for most, but not all American workers, they did not establish a 40-hour work week. There's no official 40-hour work week. What it just says is time and a half after 40 hours. The last one it does is a restricted child labor law. And you'll notice that you're given a chart. And I put in the terms that Swim did, and he probably did a video on it. He might even had a chart on a PowerPoint or something like that. But you need to know the differences between child labor laws and what they can and cannot do. And I broke it up into under 14, 14 and 15, 16, 17, and 18 plus. This is basically the way we're going to look at child labor law. Now, for test purposes, I like to change the under 14. I tell people immediately in class, scratch it out and put 13 and under. Why? Because if you're given the word 14, you think 14 and under when it's under 14. So scratch out under 14, and we do it on purpose. 13 and under is what you're thinking about. What are some jobs that you can do at 13 and under? You can work for your parents. You can work in doing a paper route, babysitting. You can work child acting. You can work in certain agricultural jobs that are non-hazardous, okay? So he's going to give you a question that says, what can little Johnny do? And in the back of the study guide, you have questions on little Johnny. Sometimes he doesn't give you an age on there, and then you have to go, oh, great, I have to guess on these things. And then certain ones will be little Johnny age 8. What can little Johnny do? Well, little Johnny could work for his parents. He can work as a child actor. He can work in certain agricultural jobs that are non-hazardous. He can maybe work babysitting, paper routes, stuff like that as well. Those are your exceptions under the 13 and under restrictions. Parents, working for your parents' business. Child acting. Paper route, babysitting. Certain agricultural non-hazardous jobs all would fall under there. I think there's an excellent question in the back of the study guide on what he can do. Basically self-explanatory, but he has other ones like the one in the back of the study guide that we'll go over a little bit later on the test. Now, the reason why I said put 13 and under is because if you get the age 14 on exam, say little Johnny, using the ones in the back of the study guide, is 14. What can little Johnny do at 14? Whereas, what can he do? Now, anything you can do at 13 and under, you can continue to do. So you can continue to child act at 14, 15, 16, 17. So if you think about it, you can do all the things at 13. So think of it in terms of going backwards on this chart. You can do these certain things at 18. You can do everything at 18. So for 18 plus, there's no restrictions if you want to add that now, okay? Then at 16, 17, you can only do these things. At 14, 15, you can only do these things. At 13 under, you can only do these things. So if you go up, i.e. you go from 13 to 14, you can still child act, you can still babysit, you can still work for your parents, you can still work for certain agricultural non-hazardous working jobs. But for 14 and 15-year-olds, You can work only a limited amount of hours. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, you can only work a limited amount of hours. I think it's 18 per week, okay? But don't quote me on that. Limited amount of hours. You cannot work during school time, okay? And you cannot work in hazardous working conditions. So you can still child act, you can still work for your parents, you can still babysit and all that stuff, certain agricultural jobs, but you still cannot do hazardous working conditions. You can do only a limited amount of hours per week, and you cannot work during school time at 14 or 15. So if he gives you a storyline, says Bill, age 14, and Jane, age 15, what can Jane do at 15 that Bill cannot do at 14? There is no legal difference between those two at all. So your answer should be Jane cannot do anything that Bill cannot do, or Bill can do everything that Jane can do. So if they hire Bill over Jane or Jane over Bill, that could be a different question altogether, but there's no difference between them. Now, if it's Bill is 13 and Jane is 14, then there's a difference, because now Jane can work limited hours. Now Jane can work after school, but not during school. She can work in non-hazardous working conditions. Whereas Bill at 13 could only work in, child labor under his parents, child acting, paper route, stuff like that, babysitting and stuff like that. Certain agricultural jobs are non-hazardous. So Jane could do more. But if it's 14 to 15, there is no difference. And that has been one of the forms that people get on the exam is person A, 14, person B, 15. Or on form B, you get person 15, and person A is 15, person B is 16. Now we go into the next category. We're now into 16, 17-year-old. What can you do at 16 and 17 that you couldn't do at 14 and 15? Well, at 16 and 17, you can work unlimited hours, meaning you could work a 40-hour work week if you so choose. You could work, after school, during school even. We'll talk about that in a bit. And you can work on weekends as well. So you could work 40 hours plus. Time and a half would come into play if you work over 40 hours. Just remember that from the Fair Labor Standards Act as well. You can work during school hours, meaning if you're one of those graduating seniors, you only have 3 credits, you could work half day if you want to. If you wanted to come in at noon every day. So say you have 2 or 3 classes at your high school and then you graduate, or you're going to graduate, so you only have 2 or 3 classes. You can do an independent work study and go off at noon and leave campus and start working. Whereas Bill, age 14, couldn't do that until after school. So you can work unlimited hours, and you can work during school hours if necessary, and if your job is part of that, and you're not missing school, obviously. But you still cannot work in hazardous working conditions. So until you become 18, you still generally cannot work in hazardous working conditions. Now, you have to decide based on a storyline they might give you, is that hazardous working conditions or not? And you have to make that decision on your own. But nobody aged 0 to 17 can work in hazardous working conditions. They can work for agriculture. 14, 15, 16, 17 can work agriculture as long as it's hazardous. And even certain conditions, you can do 13 for certain jobs in agriculture as well. Okay, so now if Bill is age 15 and Jane is age 16, there are differences. What can Jane do that Bill cannot? Jane can work more hours per week than Bill could legally. Jane can work during more hours of the week or more time during the week that Bill is not eligible for. But Bill and Jane still cannot work in hazardous working conditions. And then 18 plus, no restrictions. So you should have filled out that little chart at the very top under Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, with the chart there on child labor law. Usually you have 1 or 2 questions on child labor law. I don't know how many you'll have on this test because it's being moved, but you usually have 1, and it's usually something like a little Johnny, like in the back of the study guide, where you just need to know little Johnny's age. But make sure that if there's a comparison between little Johnny and little Jane, that the ages are in different categories. And please make sure that when we change that under 14 to 13 and under, you make sure, because 14 is its own category, it goes 14 and 15 as well. All right. The other things that you need to note about the Fair Labor Standards Act is it is under the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division, not the EEOC. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's under the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division, Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. And There was the National Industrial Recovery Act, was the precursor. Remember, this was something that was talked about in Chapter 6. The National Industrial Recovery Act was a precursor to the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, why is that important? Because it used to be Chapter 6 and Chapter 12 were on the same exam. And when that was the case, then you had a possibility of a question like that. The National Industrial Recovery Act was found unconstitutional. The Fair Labor Standards Act came after that in 1938 during the midst of a Great Depression, 30% unemployment rate. Okay, so note all those things: 30% unemployment rate, Great Depression, FLSA, what it can do, what it cannot do, and Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division is something you need to add in there under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Then you have the Whistleblowers Protection Act. Okay, it only applies to the public sector of employees, not private. What does public sector mean? Government sector, whether that's state, federal, but we're talking about federal law, so we're talking about the federal government sector, i.e. federal government. It applies not to the private sector. It occurs when public sector employees report an employer for an illegal act. It does not matter how many employees are there. It reports an employer for an illegal act. Reporting for the public good. Private gain is not public good, i.e. if you do it for revenge or you do it for blackmailing or situation, that's not for the public good. Public good is to help stop conspiracies, expose illegal activity, help police in finding crimes and stuff like that. So remember, for the Whistleblower Protection Act, the federal one, it only applies to federal government workers, okay? And only when they're reporting an illegal act for public good and not for private gain. So let's go back in terms of the storyline now that we've talked about this. Say y'all work for me in tutoring, and during the summer, you know, there's not much tutoring going on, so we don't need all the employees as much as we need during the fall and spring. So we keep you on, but we say, hey, we're going to have you sell crack cocaine to little children. You know, we need to sell some money, make some money, and sell crack cocaine to little children. We say, go to Brian, you know, start in the elementary schools, get them hooked early. That way we can have customers for life. You refuse to do this. By refusing to commit this illegal act, I fired you. You have state court or state public policy protection. Remember, refusal to disobey the law, state court, state public policy situation, correct? Therefore, if I fired you, you would have state court, state public policy exception to the employment at will. You could sue as under that exception and get your job back and stuff like that. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, what if after I do that, you tell everybody that I sell crack cocaine to little children, and then I fire you for telling everybody, telling the police that you told them that I sell crack cocaine to little children, regardless if I do or not. Okay? You refuse to sell that crack cocaine to the children. Fine. State public policy exception, state court common law exception. But what about the Whistleblowers Act? It would not apply in that situation because I'm a private employer. So if I fire you for that, for telling the police on me, I can fire you for that reason because the Whistleblowers Act would not apply to you. Because one, it's not government employees and you're not federal to begin with, you're state. So note that. Now, if I was to do that and you're a government employee, then as long as you did it not for blackmailing purposes or for private gain, i.e. revenge, and or to try to get more money out of me, then, and you were doing it to expose my activities or help the police, that would be fine, but not in the private sector. Now, states have their own Whistleblowers Acts regarding certain things at the state level, but you don't need to know that for the test purposes as well. All right, we're going to skip over Occupational Safety and Health Act because we'll talk about that with workers' compensation in a little while. We're going to do the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, also an acronym you need to know, FMLA on page 309 of your study guide. We're going to go over this one, and then we'll probably take our first break in Chapter 12 material. All right, the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA of 1993. It allowed, and this is what I call the Rule of 12, okay? For test purposes, the mnemonic device I try to tell people is the Rule of 12. Employees can take up to 12 weeks within a 12-month period of unpaid leave. Now, they can take up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave within a 12-month period. That is not a calendar year. That is a 12-month period. That could go from July to July. I can take 12 weeks off during a non-calendar year, just a 12-month period of unpaid leave. I'm not going to get paid for this under the FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act. I'm not going to get paid for it, but I can take it off for anything dealing with a serious injury, illness, physical or mental condition, childbirth, adoptions, all that stuff dealing with me, myself, my children, my parents, my spouse. All those come into play. Okay, if something happens to them, they're injured or something like that, I can take 12 weeks off of unpaid leave, and I'm still going to be able to get my job back. I may not get my exact job back, maybe, kind of modified a little bit afterward when I get back, but I'll get that job. So I'll get up to 12 weeks within a 12-month period of unpaid leave. Now, if he gives you a storyline, he'll say you get up to 12 weeks of paid leave. That'll be like multiple choices, 2 of the multiple choice paid leave, no more than 12 weeks. Well, it's unpaid leave, so those answers would be wrong. If he says within a calendar year, it's not a calendar year. So that would be one that's wrong. So now if you have 2 of them that say paid leave and 1 that says calendar year, you've already eliminated 3 of possible 4 or 5 answers on the multiple choice test. Okay? Now, the other ones that could come into play with that is how long have you been working for the company? And that is also what I call the rule of 12. You must have worked for the company for at least 12 months prior. Once again, not a calendar year, but 12 months prior. So if we're in July, July 2020, you needed to work there at least from July 2019 to July 2020. Okay? And then you can take 12 weeks within a 12-month period of unpaid leave, as long as you work for 12 months and have worked 1,200 plus 50 hours within those 12 months. So 12 weeks, or you've worked 12 months, not a calendar year, prior to taking leave and worked 1,250 hours during those 12 months. So 1,200 plus 50 hours during those 12 months. Now, why do I say 1,200 plus 50 hours? Because one, you need to know 1,200 plus 50, but the rule of 12, 1,200 plus 50. Why don't I just say 1,250 instead of 1,200 plus 50? Because this applies to government sector regardless of it. So it doesn't matter. If he gives you a storyline in which you work at an administrative agency for the federal government, you and 8 other employees, well, you work for the federal government, that applies. FMLA applies. Regardless if they only have 8 employees at your agency, doesn't matter. If you're a private sector employee, you must have 50 or more employees for more than seasonal, 20 or more weeks per year. Okay, so it's got to be more than a seasonal job. You have to have 50 or more employees for this Family Medical Leave Act to apply to a private employee. And that's why I do the 1,200 plus 50. The plus 50 is a mnemonic device, and you know 1,200 plus 50, 1,250 hours. But you also, the plus 50, that's how many employees you need for a private sector. So if he gives you Form A and says you work for a federal administrative agency with only 8 employees, FMLA still applies because you work for the federal government. You don't have a restriction on employees. If you work for a private company and they only have 20 employees, FMLA doesn't work. Title VII does. We'll get to Title VII a little bit later on. FMLA would not work. If you have 50 or more employees, FMLA works. You get 12 weeks within a 12-month non-calendar year period of unpaid leave, provided you've already worked there for at least a year, not necessarily a calendar year, but a previous year, 12 months prior to taking that leave, and worked 1,200 plus 50 hours within those 12 months. Unpaid leave for serious health conditions, physical or mental, continuing treatments, injury, illness, childbirth, adoption, foster care, seriously ill child, parent, spouse, or the employee themselves. So it affects your family directly. Any of your kids, whether they're adopted or what, stuff like that. If you go on maternity leave, you get 12 weeks of unpaid leave for that. Okay? And all medical benefits usually stay in place during that 12-week period that you're getting unpaid leave. Okay? It would not apply to the grandparents and stuff like that, only your immediate family and your parents. Okay? You get your job back, or at least a comparable position. This benefit can be denied to upper level employees, and employee must give 30 days notice if foreseeable to use the FMLA standards. Okay, one quick thing on page 310. We'll talk about the Immigration Reform and Control Act, also known as Simpson-Mazzoli, real quick, and then we'll take our break because drug testing and drugs, and OSHA, I'm going to do on the second part. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 is not the same as the Immigration Act of 24 that you might have had on your labor law test from Chapter 8. They are different. The Immigration Reform Control Act of 1986, also known as Simpson-Mazzoli, and you'll probably see it more as Simpson-Mazzoli on the exam, but know the formal and informal name. Ever since Chapter 8, that's important. Simpson-Mazzoli basically says that for an employee must present viable proof that they work. Now, the burden of proof rests on the employer to show that they have that ability to work. The ability to work is rested upon the employer. If the employee cannot be shown to have it, then the employer is going to be held in trouble. Now, for an employee to work, if you're a U.S. citizen, basically a passport, driver's license, birth certificate, social security card, any of those will be good enough for someone that works in the United States. Now, obviously, you got to worry about, Fair Labor Standards Act if you're under the age of 18 when it comes to limited hours, unlimited hours, and stuff like that. But as a citizen of the United States, you just have to show your passport, driver's license, birth certificate, social security card, and you're good. However, if you're not a U.S. citizen, then you're going to need to show your green card. Your alien registration card includes photograph. Your foreign passport with a work visa attached to it. A temporary resident card for you to allow to work in the United States. You must have an employment authorization card. So if you're an alien, i.e. a non-U.S. citizen, you must show the ability to work in the United States legally as well. And that's where you have illegal immigrants that are often violating the Simpson-Mazzoli Act. Now, the burden of proof rests with the employer to have the proof on it. All the employee has to do is show that they can work legally, and the burden of proof to prove that, in case the government wants to argue it, rests with the employer. All right, we're on the middle, page 310 of the study guide. We're going to talk about drug testing and OSHA a little bit later on. But if you look, when we come back, there'll be a page called Workmen's Compensation and Drug Testing, along with some of the acts in the other area. We're going to combine those in a little while. So we're going to take a break now, then we'll do OSHA and drug testing, and then we'll get into the federal discrimination laws.